Thank you all very much, and a warm welcome to this hour that I think is going to be hopefully fairly mind-blowing, and at least it's dry and, as Nick was saying, relatively warm in here. So I think we're in the right place for a bit of heavyweight discussion about the mind's eye, as this is entitled. I'm not going to say very much before I introduce the three of the panelists in more detail. It's worth saying, I suppose, that the soul as a concept has been out of fashion for quite a while now. The question is whether it might be on its way back and whether it might be a good thing if it were on its way back. Galen Strawson, who is on my right here, is Professor of Philosophy at the University of Reading. He's the author, among other things, of Selves, an essay in revisionary metaphysics. David Malone has directed films on science, philosophy and religion for both the BBC and Channel 4, we'll forgive him that, including soul-searching Voices in My Head. And on my left, Nicholas Humphrey, who's theoretical psychologist and whose books include Soul Dust, The Inner Eye. He's also part of a project to develop an evidence-based theory of consciousness. Evidence-based, whatever they think of next. Now, if we put aside faith-based notions of the soul, can a secular interpretation help us to make sense of consciousness? Well, I'm hoping that in the course of this we'll find out what our panelists' answers are to that and many other questions. And I'm going to give each of you a maximum, I think, of 4 minutes to set out your theory of this. You don't have to use the whole 4 minutes, but it would be useful. Let's start with Nicholas Humphrey. Nick.
Thanks, John. Well, I guess the question we were given was, to start with, was can a secular interpretation of the soul help us make sense of consciousness? And I suppose the question is what do we mean by making sense of consciousness? I'm a scientist, I'm an evolutionary scientist in particular, and of course I have two main questions about consciousness. How does it come into existence in each of our heads daily? What about the brain can create consciousness? And secondly, why did it come into existence? What happened far back in our history which actually made consciousness a good thing to have? Now, it's with relation to the second part of this that I think the soul can help. I don't think the soul can help us make sense of what consciousness is, but I think it can help us make sense of what consciousness is for, or what it's come to be for in our species, though perhaps not in other animals. As a scientist, I've seen it as my job asking this question to be what I call a natural historian of consciousness, to just go out there in the world and see what it's doing for people. I don't think we can study consciousness in the lab or the armchair for that matter. I am an experimental psychologist initially, but I think actually we need to go out there and look out there at the uses people make of consciousness. How is it changing their lives? What's it doing for them? What do they think about it? And the answer that comes back from anthropology, from religion, from daydreaming, from everything else continually is that consciousness is doing many wonderful things, but the one thing people come back to again and again is it's the basis for the human soul. And the soul has been transformative in the way we think about each other and the way we relate to each other, and in fact in the way we've come to exploit the material world. And I'll come back to that.
Nick, thanks very much, and eminently and well within our 4 minutes, but that doesn't mean to say the others get to use more. David Malone, let's deal with your sense of the soul.
Well, I think the word soul is very useful. I think it's a word which existed before the more modern self. And I think we retain both words because they point to two different things, two different sets of experiences. The experiences where you feel you did something, where you feel you can report on how you did it, when you work out how many tiles you need to tile your kitchen floor. You know there's a problem, you know how you're going to do it, and you can report on how you did it. It's the part of you that speaks, it's the part of you that works out your income tax, and you feel that it's what you're doing, and you can always tell other people how you feel you did it. But then there are, I think, a whole other set of experiences which don't feel like that, where a thought comes to you. You can't report on ever having really worked it out. There were no steps, it just came to you. And you don't know where it came from, and often they're the thoughts that feel very important, and sometimes they're transformative. And I think the word soul is useful because it reminds us there are a whole set of experiences which aren't like the ones that the word self points to. And therefore I think it's worth having both. And I think it's because we have those sets of experiences that lots of cultures have a word very much like soul. Soul, psyche, atman. So it's not something that just popped up in Hay and Why. It's been around for a very long time. Lots of human beings and lots of different cultures and lots of different ages have reported on it. I think it would be a piece of foolishness to take all of that and say, well, it's folk psychology, we can clear that away while we do some proper science. As Nick said, you've got to start with the people who have the thing that you're going to investigate and at least trust them to report on what it is. And I think part of our problem in the West, and I do think there is a problem, is that we have so few words to describe this thing, consciousness, that we're after. I mean, the main theory that we have is consciousness, self and soul. And I've read dozens of books on consciousness and listened to dozens of erudite people, and half the time I have the distinct feeling that when they use the word consciousness, that they're actually meaning slightly different things. And so they're talking past each other. The ancient Greeks had at least 4 or 5 different words which they used to point toward different aspects of it. They would talk about nous, psyche, phrenes, thumos. And I think if we've only got 3, and if we threw one away because we said it's got some religious connotations, we'd be down to 2. I mean, we have more words for mowing the lawn. We need all the words that we can get. And I think the most important thing that the soul does, and it's most of what the religious definition is, and I'd like to say I'm not religious, I don't believe in God, but we feel that there are thoughts that come from outside us, that sometimes these thoughts seem wiser than us, and we recognize that it's not really from me, I didn't do it. And then when you talk to someone else, they have the same experience. So they in them have this facility to connect to some place of wiseness where thoughts come to them and they don't feel like theirs either. So I don't think it's that strange that in the past people have thought about that and said, well, I wonder where it does come from. Maybe there's a realm of wiseness and maybe it's given to me by an all-seeing God. But what I would say is strip away that and you're still left with most of the aspects of the traditional soul. Wiseness, not you, comes from somewhere else. And I think it's the most important thing about the soul is it reminds us that a great deal of what goes on in here isn't you. The self is a Johnny-come-lately. It's like someone who moved into a mansion, exists in the front 2 rooms, answers the door every day and says, this is my house, I live here. Actually never been to most of the rooms in the house. What kind of an idiot would deny that there was something going on in the rest of the house? So I think the word soul is very important in reminding us of things that the jumped-up Johnny-come-lately self would say, don't listen to that, it's just me, I own the place.
David, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Do you think there's room for this? We're the squatters, but there's room for something else in there? Leave aside
You want
faith.
me to respond to...
No, don't. Save it up. But I think keep that thought in your mind. I think you will have a view on that.
Oh dear.
Okay, I'll just do mine. So the question was, can a secular interpretation of the soul help us to make sense of consciousness? So I assumed that a secular interpretation of the soul supposes that the soul is just the brain. And I think that's right. If we want to talk about souls at all, the soul is just the mind and the mind is just the brain. So the question is, can the brain help us make sense of consciousness? But I don't think we have to make sense of consciousness. It's just there, and I don't see any problem with that fact. And I'll say a little bit about that. So what do we find in the brain? We find a lot of common or garden elements, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, sodium, potassium, and so on, and consciousness. And when you put these common or garden elements together in the incredibly complicated way in which they are put together in brains like ours or in the brains of dogs, you get some very complicated electrochemical processes. And these processes, I take it, just are consciousness. And they are, as consciousness, generally speaking, just what they seem to be. So some people say, look, we know what carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, sodium, potassium, and so on are. And we know the kinds of reactions they get into with each other. And we know how physical processes work. And it's absolutely plain that they can't give rise to consciousness, because that's something completely different. So they say consciousness doesn't really exist, or it's some kind of illusion. But that's just wrong, because we know that consciousness exists. We know it with certainty, and we know just what it's like, generally speaking. Any 6-year-old has a completely correct general idea of what
Consciousness is just in having it. So, where are we? We know that consciousness exists. We take it this consciousness is just brain activity. What follows? What follows is that physical stuff like carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, sodium, potassium, and so on, is much more amazing than we thought, because it has the following property. When you put it together in the way it's put together in brains, you get consciousness, exactly as it is experienced by all of us all the time. So I agree with Russell that this fact about physical stuff, the fact that if you put it together in a certain way you get consciousness, is easily our best clue to the ultimate intrinsic nature of the physical. So anyone who thinks there's a problem with the idea that physical stuff can be conscious has gone wrong somewhere. One more remark. So look, doesn't physics, someone will say, doesn't physics say there's a problem with consciousness? How can physical stuff be conscious? Answer is no. Physics has nothing to say about this, absolutely nothing. And it's important that this isn't any sort of failure on the part of physics. Physics is great at what it does, but it's an increasingly familiar point that physics with its numbers and constants and equations only tells us about structure. Physics doesn't tell us about the intrinsic nature of the thing that has the structure that physics reveals. And whatever it tells us, it doesn't tell us anything that creates any difficulty with the idea that consciousness is wholly physical. That's really all I want to say at this point. Well, I'll just say this. So something funny happened. Eddington, Russell, and Whitehead were really clear about this in the 20s. And then the point somehow got lost around 1960, and philosophers started denying the existence of consciousness or saying it was an illusion, because they thought it was ruled out by physics or in conflict with physics. Well, this, as Winnie the Pooh would say, was a very big mistake.
Galen, thank you very much. Right, now we've got an idea of where everybody sits at the moment, at least in their initial opening gambits on this question. But let's broaden out the debate between the three of you now into some of the areas that this has exposed. The first one, I suppose, that we might want to talk about is whether or not these are simply terms, interchangeable terms that have come from different places for the same thing, Nick, consciousness and soul. One has a faith-based origin, the other one has perhaps a more science-based origin, and we're really talking about the same thing.
I'm sure we're not talking about the same thing, and I actually want to take issue with some other things which come before that. I mean, Galen in his little lecture started off by saying that a secular idea of the soul clearly means the brain. I don't think it means that for a moment. Ask people around here what they mean by the soul, and let's assume you're going to give a secular answer. In other words, you're not going to relate it to God or to faith of any sort. You're going to start talking about the spirit which you discover moves you, the kind of thing which David talked about. You're going to talk about what you wake up to every morning as you open your eyes and your mind gets flooded with sensory experience, with those strange and wonderful, almost magical properties and so on. No mention of the brain there. All these things are what we mean by the soul, and it's what we mean by consciousness too. And those are the issues which we have at some point to relate to the brain, but they're not the same thing as the brain. And the way in which the brain creates them is in a double step. Firstly, in my view, the brain creates a particular kind of illusory display in our mind, which we interpret as the magical qualities of sensation. On that, we build the idea of a self. On that, through culture, we build the idea of a soul. And I think the idea of a soul is a cultural phenomenon. It's not created by any one of our particular brains. It's been created by our joint brains and our ancestors' brains. So there's a lot of other issues I have around that. But on the question of whether there's nothing to discuss, Galen reminds me of William Emerson, the critic once said. He said of other critics, he said critics are of two sorts: those who simply relieve themselves against the flower of beauty, and others less continent who otherwise scratch it up. And he went on, we must confess, belong to the second of these categories. Unexplained beauty arouses an irritation in me. And I have exactly the same response to Galen. Just to say consciousness is, so let's leave it at that. That just irritates me. I want to know more. I want to know why it is, how it comes to matter, even if we accept Galen's claim that consciousness is just inherent in matter, which I don't actually think is the right way to put it. Nonetheless, it's different in different forms of matter, different combinations of matter. Our brains, when they're asleep, don't seem to have consciousness in the way they have when we wake up and so on. So the question is why, when matter gets organized in this way, does it produce this astonishing phenomenon of consciousness? That's a good question, and I think a scientific question.
Galen, do you want to come back on that?
Well, I think, in a way, I think this sounds like you're making the mistake that I think the people are making when they think that physics is in conflict with being a realist about consciousness. That is, you say it's not just the brain, but I say it is just the brain, but the brain is everything that you mentioned is there. So
Okay.
you're doing that. When people use the phrase the brain, they somehow think that it means the physical thing that you see funny pictures of, but the brain means everything that it is, and that includes all the consciousness and everything that you qualify as magical and wonderful. So the brain is just more.
Well, I mean, it's just the brain. But let's take the question of what is an illusion and what isn't, and whether illusions are not worth talking about. I mean, is the Queen an illusion? Or is she just part of our brains? The Queen is something, the notion of royalty and all the panoply which goes with it is something which has been created out of certain, and around a certain figure who exists as another rather plain human being, in other terms. We invest it with a whole lot of properties, or her with a whole lot of properties, and she becomes that very thing. She becomes a queen. I think our souls become souls by virtue of what we invest them with, because of the payoff, which in fact we get from doing just that. And to say that it's an illusion and therefore that would be to diminish it is not, I think, the right approach at all. It's a wonderful illusion. The royalty is a wonderful illusion. The soul is a wonderful illusion. Ben-Hur, when we see it on the screen, is a wonderful illusion. All these things matter to us. They count for us. They change the way we live our lives. So let's not talk about something being just an illusion as if that was somehow something we have to avoid.
I want to bring David in. You clearly do see a distinction between consciousness and soul, that they are helpful ways of describing two different things. Can you just elaborate a bit on what you think those two different things are and why they exist in that way?
Yes, I mean, I think, however one wants to describe illusion or not, I think it's a patent truth that we're conscious. I have it. If you don't, you should try it. It's great. And from an evolutionary point of view, and that's my only claim to a scientific background, there is evolution. It clearly created consciousness. At some point, it came into being. It wasn't here when we had rocks, only rocks, and now we have it. And I think, however, it's although you could say that consciousness just is, and it is in the sense that it's just a fact. But how do we experience it? And do we experience it always in the same way? And I think the soul, what we now might mean by the word soul in a secular sense, is the way perhaps that consciousness was and still is in us before the more modern self came along. What I mean to say is this: the sense of a self who steps back from who he is and says, I wonder if I feel comfortable being up here with all these very august people, and then has a moment of panic, think, God, don't start getting worried about that, you'll lose the track of what you're going to say. That sort of self which can step back and back and back, I take that to be the modern self. But I think there are possibly creatures who could think, could plan, could fornicate, could be loving, could betray each other, before there's any sign in the archaeological record that they saw themselves, before the first representation of any kind of human being, any art. So whether you say the modern self came 100,000 years ago when Homo sapiens came along, or 30,000 years ago with the first sign of representational art, a handprint on a wall, there were creatures who existed before that who were conscious. And I think that organization is still in us, and maybe that's what the word soul is pointing to. And then something new came along, this Johnny-come-lately, the self, and I think it's useful that we have that word. I think our problem is we need quite a number more. Why do we think that this most extraordinary thing that the universe has produced can be dealt with 2 or 3 paltry words? No wonder we're not making any sense out of it.
When did this Johnny come lately arrive?
Are you not trapping me with that one? I don't know. Let's say someone like Harold Bloom will say the modern self came along with Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Some other people will say the
just
ancient Greeks had it. I'm agnostic. What I'm saying is that I don't think that dogs have that kind of... I don't think there are any dogs who sit around thinking, I'm a cat trapped in a dog's body.
Hang on.
But they're conscious. So it came along sometime.
Mehitabel did.
Hang on. Did the soul come before it?
I think that yes, in the sense that a formulation of consciousness, a way that consciousness existed and thought, was around before the self. And because evolution doesn't throw things away, I would say the chances are it's still here. That creature, which is not you, sir, is in your brain and is thinking the thoughts and has the habits of mind that it had 100,000 or 1,000,000 years ago.
David, I think, well, agreeing about a lot, but actually I would put the order the other way around, and partly because I would look at child development and ask what occurs in the development of a child and the order in which these various self-conceptions begin to emerge. And it seems to me that the soul is a relatively late one, actually. That a little girl of 3 or 4 years old already has a self. We'll use the word I and so on,
yes.
And even begin to refer to other people as I and think, are they like me, and the rest of it. But the soul is a much grander idea than that. For me, at least, the soul and the value it came to have in the history of our species arose when, on top of this conception of self, culture imposed a whole lot of superordinate ideas, like, for example, the idea of immortality, of being able to perhaps reincarnation, and a whole lot of other extraordinarily important ideas to our sense of who we are and how we relate to the world, which are not just metaphysical or religious baggage, have turned out to be tremendously important in giving us the ambitions to live the lives we do and to dare live the lives we do and to have the hopes for our children that we do. Yes. So I think that idea of soul is a rather grander one in my sense than came lately. Can I come back to this question of an illusion? I think it's something we need to sort out. And Galen will know this story. Elizabeth Anscombe told it about Wittgenstein, who turned to her and said, Elizabeth, why do people everywhere think that the sun goes round the earth? And she said, well, I suppose it's because it looks like that. And he said, what would it look like if it was the other way around and the earth went round the sun? If it's the earth was revolving. And the answer is it would look exactly the same. You can't tell from what it looks like whether it's an illusion or not, because if it's an illusion, it's doing the job of replacing the reality which would have been the alternative.
I am bothered by this word illusion because it seems to me consciousness can't be an illusion, and it's clear that it really exists and it really is pretty much what you think it is. And there's actually... The point is, suppose you tried to imagine that consciousness was an illusion, well, then there'd have to be the process which was it seeming that there was an illusion of consciousness. But that process would already be consciousness. So it's actually provably impossible for consciousness to be an illusion in any sense at all.
Galen has a good line in things which are provably impossible, ab initio in a way, like you can't have free will because it's always got to get going somewhere.
Well, let's give another case. So you think you're seeing, let's say, a great big expanse of red, and someone says, no, that's really an illusion. But then what is the state that consists in your having the illusion of seeing a great big expanse of red? That has already got to have the qualitative character of redness.
No, because all representations do not have to have the character of conscious representations.
Absolutely, I agree with that.
Yes. So when we represent something as having some very remarkable, apparently almost emergent properties, which the qualia of sensation appear to most of us to have. I mean, for example, they have properties which really don't seem to fit with being physical phenomena. One particular one which psychologists have always concentrated on is the apparent fact that the subjective moment lasts more than a physical instant. I mean, of course, physical time is flowing past us without any let-up in relentless movement from one instant to another, but we don't experience a world like that, and we don't experience pains and colours and smells and things like that. They seem to hang on a little. The subjective moment lasts for longer than the physical instant. Now this, you can easily show, is actually, it's a nonsensical idea if we try and say, well, this is a physical phenomenon which is being represented as extended time. But nonetheless, it's an illusion which seems to suit us all pretty well. We like living in what I've called the thick moment of consciousness. And I've drawn the analogy between that and other visual illusions, and let's use that word again, where, for example, you'll all be very familiar with this one, the so-called impossible triangle, which you can look at a triangle made, in fact, a real object made of wood, which appears to you to be organized so that, in fact, it's impossible. The joints don't add up to each other. Well, you can make something which actually has those properties to you when seen from that particular point of view. It's an illusion. It's an illusion you know is an illusion. You can't rid yourself of it. That's just how it looks to you. And I think that many of the qualities of consciousness are the same, that we, from our perspective, are experiencing something which is in fact a piece of theatre in our brain, which has, I'll stick my neck out and say, has been designed to give us the sense of living in the midst of a piece of magical theatre, because that makes us very special kinds of creatures. We are the audience to this mystery, and being such, it lifts us outside ordinary matter and outside ordinary animality, for that matter.
But you're saying that it has value in itself because it's therefore changed our relationship with other human beings as well. Once we know we have a soul, then others have a soul as well. Therefore, we have to treat them in a different way.
That I think becomes a very important part of once we've identified this extraordinary phenomenon in our own case, then we both as a matter of generosity, but soon as a matter of just it's the easiest and only way to deal with other people, assume that they, as we are equally the centres of phenomenal consciousness, that every one of them has going on within them something quite as magical, quite as private, quite as mysterious, but quite as significant as we have going on inside us. Now, that understanding of what it is to be another person is a remarkable thing. Chimpanzees don't think about other chimpanzees like that, let alone dogs or rats think about other members of their species. We think of human beings as having souls, and that gives them the quality of what we universally regard as personhood. That has been, again, a very significant event in the history of our species once we made that move. And I've said specifically that it allowed us to enter a new ecological niche, and I call that soul land, the soul niche.
We're about halfway through. I just want to pause at this point and just take a quick straw poll of the audience. Who here believes in the idea, religious or not religious, of the soul? Anyone doesn't? Interesting. I don't know how many don't knows that leaves, but Galen, are you feeling? Does that make you feel perhaps a little more defensive about your position?
What is my position? I can't imagine why it would, because I've got so many problems with the ways things are being put. I can't possibly say them all, but you have Johnny come lately living in the front 2 rooms, and you say that's the self, and the soul is in the back, the rest of the mansion.
Yes.
But and you say we want lots of words. I want to say I am as much the thing in the back of the mansion. I've never felt that divide.
Oh no, I agree with you. I'm not saying it's not you. Sorry, I obviously didn't make that clear.
So you're saying, David, it's different aspects of it.
Yes.
Since I'm going to say the self is just the soul, and it's just the subject of consciousness, and of course I believe in the subject of consciousness, so I believe in the secular soul now that it's defined that way. But it's not something that I'm not in touch with. It's just me.
Galen, do you want to just explore perhaps a bit more about the brain and what we know and don't know about how we can have concepts like consciousness generated by physical matter? Is part of the problem that we as humans, just some of us at least, just don't accept the idea, or haven't been able to fully come to terms with the idea that this physical matter can create something that we call consciousness, because we can't see it in the way that we can see a nerve twitch or a muscle grow or shrink or diminish, or the blood flow around our body?
I think so. And I think it's just that the ordinary notion of matter, the mistake has already been made, because as far as I'm concerned, consciousness is just one form of matter. And it's actually what you get with some very ordinary elements like carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and so on. So matter is far, far more extraordinary than we think. Now, one way to put it is to say matter is far more extraordinary than we think. And we're very hooked on this notion of matter as just the stuff you kick, and that's completely wrong. I mean, as actually, I mean, look at physics. I mean, physics just gets weirder every day. And so really, there's a bad picture of matter. And once you get rid of the bad picture of matter, you can see that there's no deep difficulty. I mean, we don't understand it, but there's no deep difficulty in the idea that consciousness just is matter.
David, do you want to come in on that? Because presumably a lot of the work you do as a filmmaker is trying to represent visually or verbally concepts that are not necessarily visual ones.
Yes. Well, I think, and I feel that's quite important. And it gets to something that you said, Nick, when you said the child has a sense of self, and only later do we have this more grandiose term. Now, obviously, I agree with that, but I think that the reason it comes later is because what you're describing, from my view, is the talking part of you, when it gets old enough to be able to conjure up for itself using words what it thinks this thing is. Mm-hmm. But I think the child has it long before the bit of it that masters language can cobble together a theory of what it is. In other words, you're right. We have to, by the time we can get to be undergraduates and have learned all those long words which with which we impress ourselves, we then cobble together a grandiose thing of what the soul is. That may or may not be the soul, but what you're describing is the product of the talking bit of you, the self bit of you. Mm-hmm. I think it exists in us long before the self cobbles together its explanation of it. So I think the child does have it. I'm not saying it just is consciousness. It might be, but I think it's the expression of consciousness, the way consciousness works before you have the part of you that lives and expresses itself through the grammar of language.
Okay, well, I've never found that the best way to talk about the soul. You did ask a question whether the soul and consciousness could be interchangeable, and I would say they can't for two reasons. One is that we can have consciousness before we have a soul, and it's not we have little babies as one example, but many other animals, non-human animals, of course, have consciousness and have a certain sense of self, even which certainly is not elaborated into this idea of a soul. But equally, I think many people in the human tradition have assumed that you can have a soul even when you're not conscious. For example, when you go to sleep at night, your soul doesn't die. Your soul carries on from one moment to the next, and in fact, you re-emerge and take control over it again, or come to participate in it again next day. But it didn't, it's not a new soul next morning. So I think the words are certainly not interchangeable.
No, I agree with that. And that's why I think sometimes it's useful to try and use imagery as a way of trying to get away from trying to use words to talk about it, because words are the province of the self. Mm-hmm. And so you've got the self trying to describe the soul, and quite naturally it does a lousy job of it, because I think the self is quite happy to be king of the roost and to deny that anything else exists. And I think there's the possibility, at least, that it might exist. All I'm arguing for is to say that I think it's a mistake to think that the part of you that I would call the self, the talking bit, the bit that worries about its overdraft, is the entirety of the entity which is you. I think the entity which is Galen is that part of him, but there's a lot else. And it may not be stuff that's so easy to report on using language, because it was there before we had language, and it possibly doesn't use language itself. And it's certainly not logical and computational. We come up with answers and which we couldn't get to by any computational means at all. And that's just the result of some mathematical work. That's just a fact. Not all things can be computed. That fell out of Gödel, Turing, and Chaitin's work. So how do we do it?
Galen, can all things be ultimately the subject of a chemical process?
Can what? Sorry?
Can all things to which David was
Well,
referring
you
to the
said
subject of a chemical
you
process.
said just.
in the
I mean, chemistry isn't amazing as matter. But also, I don't have the talking bit, you see. Now I know what you mean.
Oh, good.
If the self is just the conscious self, then that's not all that I am. But I would never want to use the word self like that.
No,
the stuff
maybe
that
you
just
wouldn't. Others do, I
the
think.
stuff that just comes to mind is me, and actually the stuff that just comes to one's mind is very revealing of who you are. But I just don't want to say, I don't want to split linguistically between self and soul at all.
Why not, though? Sorry, is that right? Sorry.
Well, I just don't think there's a disunity there. I'm sure I'm not in touch with myself in many ways, but that's still, listen to that phrase, I'm not in touch with myself. It's still me.
Well, I think, we haven't actually brought religion into this at all, and
maybe now's the time.
Well, I think we were probably all agreed that human selfhood, human spirituality, long pre-existed organized religion. I've argued explicitly that actually religion was, in your terms, a Johnny-come-lately and historical
yes,
terms,
indeed,
and that it's been parasitical on human consciousness. Institutional religion, found fertile ground in human spirituality, but human spirituality existed in its own right and for very good reasons very much earlier than that, because it was the driving force of the emergence of human civilization. But of course, recently the Church has decided that they have the rights to the term soul, and have thoroughly confused the whole issue. But one that you say is secular soul going to come back? I think it is precisely by detaching itself from the religious baggage which has become attached to it more recently.
Dave, do you think there's room for that? A sort of, as Nick was saying, we didn't talk about that at the very start, but about whether there is room for a secular definition of the soul that will also be scientifically useful.
I think very definitely. I'm not sure how much we agree and disagree. I think the soul of the immortal soul from God, I personally don't believe in it, and I can't fit it into my view of the world. If other people do, that's fine, that's their business, but it doesn't work for me. But what I would say is that I think a lot of the things which are described in the religious soul, that it doesn't feel like yours, that it's possibly wiser than you, that it has thoughts which it seems to have that come to you fully formed like a gift. I think all those things are true, but I don't think they come from God in another realm. I think they come from the same physical process which is you. I just think the process which is you, as I think Galen is saying, is a lot more mysterious. And I come back to this self, which is the bit of you that's sitting there and the bit of me which is pontificating. And I think especially in science, there's been a tendency to write about the self as if it was a genius and Mother Teresa rolled in one. It's in charge of everything. I think we're all the Ronald Reagans of our own brains. We're someone who's rather good at giving speeches, has a lot of other people working for him, gets memos and reads it out very convincingly. It's actually quite thick. Because I can't claim that some of my best thoughts were mine. I didn't work them out. They just came, fully formed. And I thought, gee, that's fantastic. So it wasn't myself which did it. It was my entity. It was me. And I just want to say, I personally need more vocabulary so I can put a word here and lines, and I need that.
That's just because thoughts, no, I agree, they come from everywhere. We can share thoughts. I can have your thoughts, you can tell them to me.
Yes,
but
right.
I can't have your pains, for example. And that's why I've in my more recent work, come back again and again to sensation as the primary and most mysterious quality of all of consciousness, because it has these very strange characteristics which really challenge explanation, like the fact that it's completely inalienable, the sensation of red or the taste of an anchovy or whatever it may be. Kundera once, one of his novels, said, thoughts. Yes, thoughts are to a penny. We can throw them around, but when somebody treads on my toe, only I feel the pain. And that's the beginning of the idea of a personal self and an individual self, and the breeding ground for this extraordinarily important human characteristic of individual selfhood. And I think, I'm a great individualist in that sense. I think individualism has been crucial to our successes as creatures living in this world.
Again, and it's part of the frustration in all of this sort of debate for you that trying to come back to evidence, trying to come back to demonstrable, repeatable proof of some of these ideas?
No, I don't think so. I'm still sort of puzzling with the map here, because when you, David, say things like, it didn't come from me, that's me, the self. But
yes.
If you think you have a soul, then it did come from you, the soul. Is that right?
Yes, from my entity, yes.
Right.
It's like if I've got a big mechanism. Sorry.
Right. So I'm just saying, why not expand your notion of you, the subject of experience, to just include what you're now calling the soul? I mean, there's an interesting thing here. There's an empirical difference between people who feel that most of their thoughts just come to them, and I'm just like you in that respect. There are people who have what this psychologist called Wegner calls the emotion of authorship, or the emotion of ownership. And there are people in philosophy who say, I really had my thoughts, and I did it, and aren't I good? But I think most people, it just happens, it just comes, and lots of our language reveals this, because we say, it struck me that, or I realized that, or it came to me that, and this is the truth. But I don't feel I'm not the thing. Well, sometimes I do, maybe. I feel it's coming to me from not me. That's when I'm being the mere self, in your sense.
Again, what about volitions? Volitions don't just come to you. They don't just strike you, presumably. Do you take responsibility for what you wish or will?
I like what I like, and I don't think I'm responsible for that. I mean,
no, that's
if I like,
story. Yes.
What?
Yeah, but that's another story. But if you who believe in free will, actually, we're going to say, well, you're not going to take responsibility for it. That would be very odd.
Oh, I feel absolutely responsible, but I'm quite sure that free will is ultimately an illusion.
No.
Well, look, that's a very good point.
Yeah, I can't help that.
Well, look, I have to say, I'm not entirely sure this afternoon, as the gentleman said, whether or not we've managed to touch your soul, but at least we've come up with a few more potential words beyond the two: self, soul, intuition, subconscious, and even spirit. So there's a lexicon to go away with, if nothing else. For now, thank you all very much, and thank you to our panel.
For more debates, talks, and interviews, subscribe today to the Institute of Art and Ideas at IAI TV.